So for everyone who's here virtually, thank you for joining, and thank you everyone who's here. I'm Gigi Granval, and I have the privilege of welcoming our grand round speaker, Sherri Goodman, who is going to talk about how she has shaped national security with a focus on the environment, starting from her role as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, and then all the way to her current role, which is the author of this fantastic book, talking about her the work that she has done to get national security focused on the environment, and also her journey and what needs to happen next. So one of my mentors, Tara O'Toole, always talked about how when you're breaking new policy ground, that you are often creating new language at the same time. And so as a really good example of that, this book, the term that Sherri has coined, threat multiplier, that is now used to describe the role that environmental security, that the environment has on national security, is a great demonstration of that, and really a remarkable testament to her groundbreaking role and her continued influence. So thank you so much for being here, Sherri.
Well, thank you, Gigi. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And I've met some of your great talented faculty here this morning and more to come. And I know all of you here in the room and on the line are the next generation of leaders in this field. So it's a privilege for me to be here with you today. I hope to learn as much from you as I can tell you in my own stories. So and Tara O'Toole, I will say, by the way, was I worked with early in my career, was also a very important leader in health. So I'm going to tell you the story about my book, Threat Multiplier, and the climate, military leadership, and the fight for global security. I hope you will buy the book. I think there are some cards on it here, but I want you to hear the story and see maybe yourselves reflected in it, or questions about where you want to go in each of your own careers. So I'm going to, this is our talk today. I'm going to go through the birth of environmental security, talk about some regional risks, leading by example, and then how we can climate-proof security. So the main, thesis of this whole story is that in the last few decades, we've seen a dramatic convergence between climate change and national security. And I would say, being here with you all, students at the Bloomberg School, health is a vital component of this. I don't think it was well understood early, 40, 50 years ago in the Cold War. We developed and produced nuclear weapons, and then as an afterthought, we thought about the impacts on human health and the environment. Okay, now we have a different conception. We start earlier to understand that. Doesn't mean we don't do things that are bad for the environment, bad for the climate, and bad for our health, but we have a broader conception. So the concept here is that over the last several decades, we've seen a convergence. On the top line, you see the major markers of national security from the formation of NATO and the Cold War and the Strategic Defense Initiative. And coming along on the bottom axis are the major markers of changing environmental awareness, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the UN Environment Program, the International Panel on Climate Change, and then leading into the 9/11 era and the COVID era, where health really is today. You all are, the nexus of health and security is natural to you because you're all been part of the COVID era where it's so fundamental. So that's the premise, and that's been a lot of my own life's journey. So when I started out, I served as one of the first female professional staff members on the Senate Armed Services Committee in the 1980s. And my career started in nuclear weapons. There wasn't even an environmental course taught at Harvard Law School when I went there, or at Harvard Kennedy School. And I wasn't actually focused on that. I was focused on how do we reduce the major challenges of that era, which were the nuclear threat from the Soviet Union. And when I joined the Armed Services Committee, I had oversight of the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons complex, and within a year, all the reactor plants and processing facilities failed for environment, safety, and health reasons. In fact, I was about to enter one of these plants one day on a tour at the former Rocky Flats plant in Colorado. And I was in my late 20s, and they said to me, "Ma'am, are you childbearing age?" And I was. And they said, "Well, don't go in that building because we have a glove box operation in there." And that plutonium pits were being processed. So I didn't go in. But there were women who worked in that building. And within a few months, it was shut down for criminal violations of environment, safety, and health laws. And then the world changed, and Terre Haute was in the Department of Energy at the time. And we changed from a weapons production to weapons cleanup and environmental and safety health management. In fact, one of my first pieces of legislation that I drafted on the committee was to create the Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board, which is about safety and health at defense nuclear facilities. Okay, so that's how I went into the waste world. And then I joined the Department of Defense at the beginning of the Clinton administration in 1993. And during that period, at the end of the Cold War, we were closing a lot of military bases. So that's a picture of me there running with President Clinton in Alameda, California, and in Oakland, where we were closing a major Navy base. And in that era, we were focused a lot on how to remove the waste safely from these military bases, how to convert the property, what kind of property could be converted to, and working very closely with EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, health agencies, and state and local agencies. And in fact, during that era, I also had under my purview a group called the Armed Forces Pest Management Board. And those were the military epidemiologists and toxicologists whose responsibilities were to understand disease vectors, both as they affected our troops when they deploy, and also to work with us in the cleanup of some of these military bases. In that era, we were not only dealing with contaminants, sort of the pollution side of environment, but we were also working on what I call the green, the natural resource side, because the military is the nation's second largest landholder and trains on a lot of areas that have diverse natural resources and endangered species. And at Fort Bragg there, now it's called Fort Liberty, but in North Carolina, the Army training was shut down for a time for failure to protect the endangered red-cockaded woodpecker that lives in the longleaf pine tree, which once was the dominant ecosystem across southeastern United States, and now is found mostly on military bases from Florida to the Carolinas. So the Army and the Department of Defense incur major stewardship responsibilities, not only there, but particularly in California, and all over the country and other parts of the world, to ensure we protect those natural resources. And oh, by the way, we found out in that era that we could still train. In fact, once the military actually thought about it, the Army and Marines found that they could, instead of cutting down the tree, which where the bird makes its nest, it could keep the tree as a realistic training obstacle and improve its training. In fact, the Marine Corps had a whole environmental campaign in that era called Saving a Few Good Species, which is a play on, a few good, what used to be a few good men. Now it's, of course, more diverse. And sort of the third component in this era, what I call the first chapter of environmental security, was cooperating with former adversaries and allies and partners. So international environmental cooperation. This was one program that we launched called Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation with Russia and Norway. Those are the Secretaries of Defense, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry, and the Russian and Norwegian defense ministers signing that agreement in 1996. And on the far side, you see a much younger me in front of this large cask that we built to safely offload for the Russians a liquid nuclear waste that was leaking from decommissioned Russian submarines, about 100 of which had sunk in the Kola Peninsula. And Norway was very worried that leaking radioactive and hazardous waste would contaminate its fishing grounds. And so we launched Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation, both to deal with those liquid waste streams, but also we shared a lot of training and information. That's me and others speaking at a Russian military academy. Unfortunately, that era now has long since passed. We're not cooperating with the Russians, but the era of cooperating on environmental training and education still continues in many parts of the world. Okay, now forward into the 2000s, I convened the first group of generals and admirals to assess the national security implications of climate change in 2006 and 7. And that's where I coined the phrase threat multiplier, as we had spent a year with the nation's leading climate scientists like Jim Hansen and others, as well as intelligence and national security professionals. And we understood, even back then, when climate wasn't as much a daily in-your-face experience as wildfires and hurricanes and floods are today, that projected climate change, and that's what we called it back then, projected climate change, would pose a serious threat to America's national security. And we defined threat multiplier as having climate change act as increasing instability in some of the most volatile regions of the world, but that it would affect us even in stable regions, add to tensions even in stable regions. And we connected climate change, energy, and national security as sort of key set of related global challenges. And then we did about 10 different reports. This is another one about the accelerating risks of climate change. And that really reshaped how the national security community, not only the Department of Defense, but the president, our allies and partners, and many others thought about climate and the nexus between climate and security. And here's what we call, we call the threat multipliers of climate change. You know them, heat, which has increased dramatically just in the last few decades, prolonged drought, wildfires that know no season, sea level rise, flooding, storms, and others. And it's not only those physical impacts of climate change. And this graphic I actually took from a report of a board that Gigi and I both serve on, a study I led for the State Department's International Security Advisory Board just last year, connecting on the right the climate trends, or maybe your left, climate trends, the physical risks with the cascading and compounding risks that we see. So it's those physical risks of drought, rising temperatures, sea levels, ocean acidification, other extreme weather events, leading to food insecurity, energy and water insecurity and scarcity, exposure to disease that you're all dealing with and trying to understand better, and that amplifying the risks of instability and conflict. And then that all happens on top of pre-existing health conditions, pre-existing governance conditions of weak states, fragile states, and uncoordinated, and now we have uncoordinated migration and a number of other demographic and other challenges that we face. So let's look at this, take a couple of regional romps around the world here and see what's happening. In the Arctic, you've got melting ice and rising tensions as sea ice retreats, ocean temperatures warm, permafrost thaws and collapse. This is Admiral James Fogo, who as a young submariner was up in the Arctic, and they do an ice pick maneuver, and they launch the submarine up onto the ice, as you see there, and then the sailors like to get out and maybe put on a Santa suit and play a little baseball, get some photos to send back to the family. Well, that was in the 80s. And then he goes back about 20 years later, as now he's commander of the submarine, and he calls for the ice pick maneuver to go up onto the ice, but there's not enough ice anymore. And when he surfaces approximately where he'd been before, he finds blue water and plastic waste. So that was his own experience. And now you see on the map an increasingly open Arctic, with Russia trying to convert the northern sea route that hugs its long Arctic coastline into a toll road for transportation from ports in Asia to ports in Europe. and China eyeing that access to those shorter shipping routes, as well as the resources, the minerals, the energy, and in the future, the fish that could be available. Okay. In the Middle East and North Africa, a region that's long been rich in oil but poor in water, even more so now in the climate era. This is General Tom Mittendorf. Chris, we talked about, he's my co-chair on the International Military Council for Climate and Security. He deployed many times in Afghanistan, Somalia, Iraq, and found that in many of these places, whether it's the Taliban or ISIS, taking control of the Mosul Dam that's pictured here, you found that water insecurity was leading to vulnerability and allowing terrorists to basically use that as a petri dish, climate change acting as a petri dish for increased terrorist activities. And when he went and others to develop water sharing arrangements in local communities, that reduced some of the tension. Not enough, of course, to solve the problems that we have overall in the region, but those modest efforts at environmental peace building did help to a certain extent. And in other parts of the region, and this is Swati Veeravali, who serves now on the National Security Council and is an Army Corps of Engineers environmental scientist, has spent a lot of time working with our allies in Kenya on climate and climate cooperation and security, and coined the phrase that I talk about in the book, which is, I think, part of the future here, mutually assured resilience, working with our allies and partners. And there's a large health component to this as well. In the Cold War, we talked about mutually assured destruction, where the nuclear weapons of the US and Soviet Union pointed at each other, ensured a level of stability because we knew we could annihilate each other. Now, in the climate era, we need mutually assured resilience. It's not going to be enough just for us to put walls around our cities or our country and say, well, we're going to protect ourselves, because first, of course, climate knows no boundaries. And second, because we can't be resilient as a society on our own. Okay, moving to the vast Indo-Pacific, Admiral Locklear, who was a former commander of Indo-PACOM, dared to say already close to 10 years ago that he thought climate change was the greatest long-term threat in the Indo-Pacific region. And that's because he spent much of his tenure as PACOM commander deploying forces to respond to increased typhoons and the disaster alley that features across much of this region, responding and deploying forces to rescue those in the Philippines and Indonesia and Vietnam, and finding that with each successive storm, societies already quite vulnerable and living on the edge, such as pictured here in Bangladesh, are ever more vulnerable. And in the small island Pacific nations such as Kiribati, which is a large part of the strategic context now when we think about how to defend against a future threat with China or Chinese influence across the whole region, we also have the fact that many of our key allies and partners like Kiribati, Tuvalu, may lose quite a bit of their property in coming decades from sea level rise and loss of fresh water, and are already thinking about how do they, this is former President Anote Tong of Kiribati, how do we migrate with dignity? Migrate with dignity, a concept that I think will grow in coming years as they think about moving. They've bought property in Fiji. Others are thinking about moving to Australia or New Zealand. And we see growing climate migration and displacement around the world, with many more people on the move, particularly from the equatorial regions, and many more people displaced by climate disasters. Of course, that comes with health consequences. And then we have in our own hemisphere, this is General Laura Richardson, who's now the commander of Southcom, one of our first female 4-stars. We also have the Chief of Naval Operations, Lisa Franchetti, and the first female Commandant of the Coast Guard, Linda Fagan. So it really is a whole new era. She's on the front lines of dealing with a region that faces both increased migration, drying out, extreme weather events, and societies that already are not that resilient from weak governance, overexploitation of their natural resources. And so that's part of the mix that she's dealing with, continually responding and trying to improve the security of that region. Okay, let's come back home a little bit and talk about climate readiness on the home base. Many military bases in the US are very vulnerable to sea level rise, wildfires in the West, extreme weather events. This is Admiral Ann Phillips, who formerly was in command at Norfolk and headed the Expeditionary Strike Group there, also deployed forces during Hurricane Superstorm Sandy to basically have when the Navy had to take control of the port in New York, because the port managed usually by the Coast Guard got knocked out in that storm. And she deployed her forces from the Norfolk Navy base, itself vulnerable, up to Sandy. And this is Tyndall Air Force Base, where the hangars on the F-35, this is Air Force Base in Florida, got destroyed in Hurricane Michael back in 2018, and is now becoming the DoD climate resilient base of the future. So let's talk a little bit about energy, which relates to greenhouse gas emissions. DoD is a large user of energy, the single largest user in the US government, and about 1% of total US energy. Most of that is in what we call operational energy, or for aircraft, in the Air Force, ships and tanks. And then we have bases installation energy. The military has a massive, ambitious goal now to go to net zero at all its major bases, to go net zero for energy by 2050 and net zero on electricity by 2035, installing microgrids, renewables, battery storage, and I could give you the whole talk about energy, but we won't do that today because just give you this one here, a couple examples: solar for remote deployments, moving out of fossil fuels, and efficiencies. But I wanted to spend with you a little more time on the kind of health and human side, because I know that's where you are working in your own careers. And so I pulled here from a study, a couple of slides for a study of the Defense Science Board that I served on last summer for a study on climate change and global security. And the Defense Science Board is a group of leading scientists, academics, national security professionals who examine topics at the request of the Secretary of Defense that are considered of important interest to the department. So the fact that it would do a study on this is good. It's probably not its first study. I served on the studies a couple of years ago too, but with each successive one, they have more impact. It's sort of moving the vast Department of Defense to take seriously these risks. So this is from that study looking at how diseases influence climatic hazards. And you can see how that growth is increasing. And that's going to fall in your laps to help us figure out how to deal with. And then let's talk about the readiness of our forces, because climate and infectious disease increasingly affecting our forces when we deploy. As I said, in the 1990s, when I had oversight of the Armed Forces Pest Management Board, we were mostly looking at the disease vectors we understood then. But now the disease vectors, have increased in terms of their geographic range for deployments. And then we have to look at how can troops protect themselves. So this is from the Army's Development Command, looking at how they can collect data by soldiers as they're deployed to better understand continuous health monitoring. And here you can see how increasing temperatures are affecting our troops, from hospitalizations, reportable events, and ambulatory visits over the last approximately from the period 2015 to 2019. And so that is a significant concern for our forces, which leads to the Black Flag days that are increasingly experienced in the climate era. Black Flag days are when the temperature, as you probably know, is above approximately 95 temperature with wet bulb humidity, and so it's unsafe for troops to train. And so with that increasing in Black Flag days, there had to be adjustments in training. And here you can just see one example, just at one base, the number of Black Flag days increasing over this period of time. So in the 90s, we talked about having to own the night with night vision goggles. Now our Deputy Secretary of Defense talks about how to own the heat. How can our troops operate in hotter temperatures? And you all are going to be part of helping us figure that out. Okay. Now I will, I'm going to go to the last section and tell you about how I think about where we need to go. So, okay, you made it through the whole book now. What do I say? What do I think we need to do about all this problem that we have, besides reduce our greenhouse gases emissions through our energy systems? Well, we need to do that. But the first is, and I think there's health components in each of these four dimensions here. The first is improving our predictive capability. Some of that is about closing the gap between near-term weather and big global climate models. Today, we have weather predictions that are reliable out for about 1 week. And then if you look at global climate models, they project out for 50 to 100 years. They're on a global scale. So you've got a weather, you've got a time scale and a geographic scale. The gap is in having near-term data models for defense or other decision makers to have that give you short-term climate prediction. I call it precision climate intelligence. And the Defense Department, like at Johns Hopkins APL, your affiliate here at who works a lot with the Defense Department. They're working also with our national labs, Sandia, Los Alamos, Livermore, where Gigi and I also had served on an advisory board to basically develop those decision-making models that give us that real term, that close that gap. Because if you want to plan a war game or you want to plan a military operation, where you've got to know how to reset this base so it can be more resilient, you can't use a global climate model and you can't use short-term weather. You need a predictive capability. And some of that is going to include health system information and data too. So there are a lot of parameters in this. They're being developed, as I said, both in the private sector. Every sector of society really needs this improved climate intelligence, whether it's for insurance or transportation, the financial sector, real estate, for example, the fact that you can't get insurance in some states now in part because of growing climate risk, fire risk in the West or flood risk in the East. So that's number one. Number two is managing the unavoidable impacts of climate change. You know, temperatures have already risen. So much of climate is already baked into society for at least the next several decades, even if we do a good job in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, and we're not doing such a good job. But so we have to become more resilient. Health systems is a big part of that resiliency, infrastructure resilience, and community resilience. All components of it have to be able to withstand the kind of shock and awe we're going to experience from changing climate extremes. Third, it's about creating mitigation, which in DoD means creating a net zero military. There is a lot going on in this area of energy technology, energy advances, as I said, from microgrids to renewables, to advanced fuels, to more efficient weapon designs, to changing the way we train and operate. And it's an exciting area of innovation that is working also with private sector to really develop sort of the next generation of and move us through that, accelerate through the energy transition. And then finally, it's about our alliances, how we work with our allies and partners. I've been pleased that in the last few years, we've seen a lot of integration of understanding climate and security risks into the mainstream of foreign policy and national security and defense policy, working with our allies from the Asia Pacific to Latin America, certainly in NATO, which just stood up its first Center on Climate and Security, And I've been a very much integral part of that through the International Military Council on Climate Security, and that's now based in Montreal. So that's an awareness by, our strongest military institution of how important climate change is in NATO. So those are kind of the four buckets. And here's the book. And I have a lot more stories in the book. I told you a few of them here. And I am happy to answer your questions, and thank you for having me today.
People can raise their hand if they have questions.
Thank you, really nice talk. Big picture, I was wondering how you dealt with any pushback from government, military, and non-allies in trying to move this stuff forward, since there's this still question, is climate change real?
Great question. That the way you framed it, is climate change real? Isn't it? It was the question for a long time. And there's always pushback, either from within the department or within society, within Congress. First of all, when we started the Military Advisory Board, first we relied on facts and evidence. And as I was discussing with Chris earlier, when we talk about who are trusted validators in society, you as health professionals are at the top of the list. And the military is right up there too. And the military voice is important. I'd say the question that gets asked sometimes today is framed as not whether climate change is real. People don't as much deny that anymore. Or they did, but they say, well, but isn't the greater threat to fight with China? Or isn't there some other risk that's more important than climate change? And my answer to that is, look, we have to walk and chew gum. You can't say, yes, China is a threat to our way of life. Yes, Putin's aggression against Ukraine has to be combated. And we face conflicts in the Middle East and instability around the world. But it's all happening in the context of climate change. We say China is the pacing threat for our military today, but climate is the shaping threat. It shapes the entire environment. So you can't ignore it. If you ignore it, you do so at your peril. We have to be able to do both. And I think that's how I think about it. And I'll say also what resonates well and why we have more bipartisan action on the national defense, or through the annual defense bill on climate, probably than in other areas of legislation, is because all members of Congress want to keep their military base and their troops. So everyone wants to protect the troops, the health of the troops, and everyone wants their base to stay where it is. And oh, by the way, we have a lot of bases today. Most of them are in red states, and many of them are in climate vulnerable areas, whether it's the drought-stricken Southwest, or wildfires, or the flooding along the Gulf and Southern coast. So, why did the Florida congressional delegation, which is all Republican, call for rebuilding Tyndall Air Force Base right after it got slammed by Hurricane Michael? Well, they didn't want to lose that base. They want it to be a resilient base. So that allows for a certain level of bipartisanship that maybe in some other quarters is a little harder to come by.
One of the things I really enjoyed about the book was how the kind of aha moments that some of the generals had when they were thinking about how they are used to making decisions with not all complete information, and how, that projecting out and thinking about, like, wait a second, we need to be prepared for this, this thing, even though we don't know all. Can you talk a little bit?
Sure, that's great, Gigi. Thank you. And you all, as health professionals, you're often making decisions, or will be making decisions, with perhaps not all the information you want at any one time. And it's really a risk management issue. That's how the military thinks about it. You assess whatever risk you have in front of you. You assess the likelihood of the threat, the probability of the threat, and the consequence. So in the Cold War, we talked about the nuclear threat from the Soviet Union as being a low probability but high consequence event. In other words, we could annihilate each other. So it was worth investing billions of America's GDP to defend and deter that threat through our nuclear triad and through other elements of our deterrence and defense posture. Now, in the climate era, and this is really was one of the aha moments for the generals and admirals on the first CNA military advisory board. They were like, well, wait a minute, climate change is a high probability risk, and its consequences are also high. So now we have something that's high and high probability and high consequence, and we need to do more to defend it. And they looked at the evidence. The other issue is that the other way to frame this, that's one dimension. The other is, as General Sullivan, who was the former Army Chief of Staff and the first chairman of the CNA Military Advisory Board, said, if you wait for 100% certainty, you know something bad is going to happen on the battlefield. So you don't wait till you get something like, well, oh, climate's over there. No, I'm not going to think about that yet, or the terrorist is over there. I'm not going to think about it till it's in my face. No, the military is constantly, they're a risk management organization. The responsibility in protecting America and Americans is to assess whatever risks are out there, and then understand what's the likelihood of that occurring and what level of investment we should make to defend and deter.
Oh, I can just say it.
Okay.
So I don't know where to start. So if we can kind of go back to like one of your first slides on like the security and like eco like intersection, like there wasn't really any mention of like the US's involvement in each step of that like security portion or like national threat, like how like our actions are kind of like leading towards more terrorist groups, and how eco-terrorism is like kind of a little bit of the US's fault because of international diplomacy and things like that. Also, like, I don't know, the whole like net zero for the military, like that's cool, but like if we're not going to like stop doing like war crimes, like what's the benefit of doing net zero? You know what I mean? Like, I don't see like what the benefit is of reducing the military's like energy expenditure and making it green if we're going to continue to like pollute the world and like make it unjust for other nations.
Well, I mean, you raised some good questions, but I would say, the history of American foreign policy, national security throughout our history, we have, of course, not done everything right. And there have been some injustices, but as a democracy and a nation, we've done more good than not. I'm not going to defend every aspect of America's record. My parents are Holocaust refugees. I feel very fortunate that I'm even here. And many didn't make it out. And there are a lot of injustices in the world, and the military is not perfect. But we do have civilian control of the military in this country, which is a good thing. As long as we have it. And, I think there's nothing about war that is environmentally friendly. Let's just state that, right? I mean, that is obvious. But unfortunately, we as humans haven't figured out how to end war right now. Maybe when women rule the world, we'll actually figure that out, and we'll, really have more focus on the environmental peace building. And I'll say I received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Environmental Peace Building Association this summer, because the other side of what I do is about kind of taking this understanding and sort of sharing it to build cooperation, trust, and understanding among communities and around the world. So I think I've already seen that transition from being early in my career. I was often the only woman in the room, and now I'm never the only woman in the room. So I'm not saying that's the answer, that women won't wage war, but I do think when we have more equitable societies at all dimensions and all diversities, we may have less conflict. But I also think that's a bit utopian. I don't think, unfortunately, that's going to happen in my lifetime, which is why I still think we need to have a strong defense. We have to have strong allies and partners. We have to know what our values are, and we, you know, and that's how I think about it.
Thank you for your talk. It was wonderful. I had maybe a question to try to tie together a few different threads. Currently, the military is probably the best technology when it comes to nuclear powers. The Navy uses it in all of their vessels. Is that part of the solution for going to net zero in the military? And is that technology that something that you see could be used more broadly domestically to reduce carbon emissions more generally with electric power?
Great question. I do think what we are seeing a resurgence in the next generation of nuclear energy. It really, I mean, the Navy's nuclear energy has been very safely operated over decades, and it is possible for reactors to power into the community when they're, you know, at base. Though I think that's less. And that may be a future possibility. More likely, what is also going to happen is the development of small modular and micro reactors. They are not only for military use, but there is one planned for a military base in Alaska. At the same time, you know, Bill Gates is funding, you know, another small modular reactor at a former coal plant in Wyoming, and there are a couple of other projects underway. There are many other countries. South Korea, I'd say, is really in the lead on developing small modular nuclear technology, other countries as well. And the other dimension of this is that if US is not leading in this technology area, China and Russia certainly are, and are increasingly providing those reactors and fuels to countries where we face safety and proliferation risks for their continued growing share of that international market. So there is a security challenge here in both having America's renewed leadership. We kind of let go our nuclear energy, our civilian exports of nuclear energy for some decades. And now with the climate, with awareness on climate and sort of a changing view about the acceptability of advanced nuclear reactors and better assessment of and management of sort of waste, safety, and proliferation risks, which have been the historic three concerns on nuclear power, I think we're seeing a kind of new generation of nuclear.
Hi, thanks so much for coming to speak with us today. So my question is, in all of your efforts and success that you've had at these different levels, you've obviously had to engage with different stakeholders with very different priorities. And I would wonder if you could speak to us a little bit about, you know, Department of Defense that is very dependent on the requirement to be able to execute action, that requirement coming from Congress, you know, wanting to support all of their people from their different locations, and how you navigate those different priorities to bring everybody to the table for a, you know, similar end state that you're all working towards.
Great question. Well, you know, it's about creating the right set of partners you need for any particular set of problems you have at a given time. So, you know, when I first came into the Department of Defense in the 1990s, the big problem environmentally was that we had over 100 Superfund sites. And there were a lot of critics and communities about that waste that need to be cleaned up at active and closing bases. That was one set of issues. And also non-compliance with air, water, and waste laws. And there were a lot of lawsuits against the Department of Defense at the time on those grounds. So one of the first things I did was to kind of open up what we were doing to the stakeholders and even the critics. I invited a lot of those environmental organizations into the Pentagon. Most said, "Oh, we've never been in here before. Nobody ever invited us in." You know, and I found that by building those relationships, in part, by being honest about, you know, the fact that sometimes we didn't know everything, or we didn't have enough budget to do something, or maybe we weren't doing things the right way at certain localities. we could change how we did things, and created over 100 community advisory boards at our military bases with cleanup, and we call them restoration advisory boards. And they very deliberately had a community co-chair and a base commander co-chair. So it wouldn't just be DoD talking to everybody, they'd be engaging together and getting input on decisions. And that has been very effective. So I'd say that sort of partnering ethos and being open to inclusion at every level. Now I'd say the analogy today is doing that with resilience building on, in military bases and communities. That's one level, that's kind of at the local level. And I think that can also be effective in the health conversation too, because, the risk, people feel and experience their risks, even their health risks differently. We found that when we were assessing, let's say people had complaints about a water or air pollution risk at a military base, what's the community experience, and where do you need to do the off-base testing or health engagement? And I think that's still, going to be true. That's still true today. So, and then at the international level, well, it's about having the right set of allies and partners and community groups through a variety of different, whether it's NATO or UN or other international forums and organizations, and kind of the local to national, and building that network. Environmental Peace Building Association is a good example, where they have a lot of local community-based groups around the world, but they're networked into larger groups and have access to the resources.
Thank you. I think there was yep.
Thank you. You were talking about net greenhouse neutrality for the military, but what about military contractors, DoD contractors? As of this year, they didn't have to report greenhouse gas emissions, and then when the Biden administration tried to force them to report, the DoD pushed back and halted it. When you had that feedback loop about climate change and how it affects world politics, it didn't include the sources of climate change. So what is the thought and the approach for contractors that are emitting a lot of emissions and the DoD contributing to climate patterns changing and also contributing to these political instability?
Right, well, my understanding is that the scope 3 emissions are included. So that would be the contractor emissions. Now, whether it's fully being enforced today, I don't know. These things take a while to develop the systems to manage and monitor. I'd say major defense contractors, for the most part, when they want to show and be able to compete, especially since many of them also are competing for contracts in the EU, where environmental rules are even tougher. They want to meet those standards. And that does include what you call the scope 3, the slowdown of the contractor emissions. I think, there could always be improved data and reporting. I don't think it's as good as it could be. Although I think that I'd say overall there's been good efforts. I think we're still at the beginning of a sort of more fulsome kind of reporting system, but that's true probably not only for the Department of Defense, but for the federal government overall.
Speak loud. I'm going to speak loud. How does the DoD approach intergovernment, regulatory factions? Like, for example, I know a lot of military bases are Superfund sites that are regulated under the EPA, but I also know that there's a difference in the regulatory capacity of the EPA with other government agencies versus with private industries. So I guess, how is the approach changing to address this inequity, where when it's some sort of intergovernment regulation change, how are you making it so that the EPA is an important factor in making sure that military bases, especially Superfund sites, are
being addressed as such in the same fashion as if the private industry were polluting to the same capacity?
Well, we addressed that, and, that was one of the first things I had to deal with when I joined the Department of Defense in 1993, because we had a base closure law in effect at that time. And that meant that President Clinton, in the first few months of his tenure, had to accept or reject a round of about 100 closing military bases. And that was that round of bases that to be closed was determined by an independent commission. You couldn't cherry pick in Congress themselves, because nobody ever wants a closing base. So the law was designed to sort of take the politics, to take the electoral politics out. And in that round in 1993, there were a lot of bases in California, which had been very important to President Clinton's election. So when he accepted, reluctantly at the time, this round of closing bases, he wanted to have a very proactive strategy to help those bases with what he called job-centered property disposal, because many bases, communities thought they lose jobs, and he called it fast-track cleanup. Now, I will tell you, having served in government for a long time, if you're in DOD or EPA or anywhere you are, there's nothing particularly fast about any environmental review. It might be effective, but it's not fast. The government processes are designed to be effective, but they're not always designed to be efficient. In other words, fast. So when the White House said to me, well, we're changing the framing of your cleanup initiative, we had called it common sense cleanup. And they decided they didn't like that. Common sense sounded too slow to them. So they said, we're changing it to fast track cleanup. And I said, oh, well, now, well, how are we going to do that? And because EPA had already told us, they said, well, if you want to do, you want to hit these milestones for cleaning up, your Superfund bases in the base closure program at these intervals. He said, we don't have the staff to do that. They said, well, and so I actually transferred funding. I transferred $7 million of funding over about 5 years to the EPA so that they could hire more staff so they could do fast track cleanup with us. So that's how I solved that particular problem. It is true that environmental agencies, and particularly state agencies, are often very under-resourced, state EPAs. And so they're often, they often get requirements, as we say, they're asked to do reviews, but they can't keep up with it. So that's how we addressed it at that time, which was to transfer funding.
And do you do the same thing with international bases? Because a lot of countries have different environmental standards, some of which are more relaxed than the United States. Do you automatically default to the US standards when, obviously when we're trying to close down a base in another country?
There's a whole negotiated process that goes on with a host nation. I forget the actual term of it now, but there's a process by which the host nation and the US, when we have a basing agreement, determine exactly which standards are going to apply. And then so there's a whole negotiated process, and then those are the standards. So if we have a base in Germany and we've negotiated a certain set of standards, that's how it's addressed. It's usually some kind of mix between the host nation and the US. Yes.
Jen? Oh,
Go ahead.
and somebody else is speaking.
No, go ahead. Speak loudly. I was trying to get it so that it was different on Zoom, but my Zoom skills need some work, so go ahead.
I can't imagine them working at the intersection of military and environment. You have to do a lot of selling environmentalism to the military.
Well, not anymore. No, your generation now, who are the young leaders, and even those older than you, have had this awareness. I'd say when I was your age, yes, sometimes it was an uphill battle, or they thought, okay, well, you clean up that stuff over there, but we're gonna deal with the important readiness and the troops and everything else over here. But I'd say that's really changed. Now it's much more mainstream, and particularly climate considerations, which are global in nature and really have a strategic threat, whereas, yes, okay, we have got to clean up contamination of bases. And sometimes that's, and that's a real problem, but that's not necessarily a strategic threat. But now we have climate, which acts as a threat, as we said, a threat multiplier in sort of changing up. How are we going to have, how are we going to ensure security across the vast Asia Pacific, or how are we going to reduce instability in drought-stricken parts of Africa? So now I think it's much better understood. Now, the kind of next piece of this is really to have what we call kind of climate literacy throughout the Department of Defense. And that means more than just having the environmental office understand climate. That means having every part of the department, whether it's the weapons buying part or the personnel part, readiness, research and development, even the green eye shade budget types need to understand what those investments are. And there's certainly policy. So that's what's really happening now. And then at every echelon. So not just the generals, but, at the mid-grade levels and, even at the, entry and the grunt levels. We used to say, General Wes Clark used to say, a tank is an oil spill waiting to happen, right? So now we have to think a bit differently about how do you wash and clean, your ground vehicles. And oh, by the way, hybrid vehicles actually give you, are quieter and they give you better torque. So we've actually found that some advanced energy technologies are not only greener, but they give you better performance as well.
That was a great question because I wanted you to talk about some of those opportunities and how things are, some of these technologies have led to, defense doesn't always, they won't want to reduce their carbon footprint just for the, just for ideal's sake, but then it helps them and that sort of the threat opportunities to be able to meet those goals.
Right, we say sometimes it's more about the mission than emissions. Because that itself doesn't always sell in defense, but also until about 10 years ago, it was thought that if you wanted a more effective, more lethal weapon system, it required more fossil energy. So if it has to go faster, or have, and that, so it was hard to break that Gordian knot. But finally, after a Defense Science Board study on energy about 10 years ago, we got approved energy as a key performance parameter in the design of weapon systems. And that's begun to reshape how we think about energy. And then also the energy transition, understanding that you could actually have a more effective system, sometimes with a better battery or a hybrid vehicle, or there's a new design. For example, there's a new design for aircraft called blended body wing. And that new design is 30% more aerodynamically efficient. So even on existing fuels, even for existing fossil fuels, it's more efficient. So all of those elements, and efficiency, of course, is also a very important fuel. What you don't have to use is sort of the best thing. So efficiency has long been a cause, particularly efficiency in building standards.
So I think that's going to be the last question. I think we have a number of other opportunities to get to talk to Sherri Goodman, but please join me in thanking her for